The Trump administration's tariffs on Chinese goods is now in effect, the latest move in what's becoming a trade war between the world's two largest economies. The tariffs place a 25% tax on $34 billion worth of goods related to aerospace, auto, and information technology. China retaliated with new tariffs on American-made products, including pork, dairy products, and cars. China's Commerce Ministry responded, saying they had to respond with counterattacks. The Chinese premier also commented, saying a trade war would have no winner. In the United States, farmers and manufacturers could bear the brunt of China's retaliatory measures. The National Association of Manufacturers also condemned the president's policy, writing, quote, "No one wins in a trade war, and it is America's manufacturing workers and working families who will bear the brunt of continued tariffs." CBS News Chief White House correspondent Major Garrett joins me now. Major, the president's tariffs on Chinese goods went into effect Friday morning. Several Republican lawmakers have voiced their reservations on how effective these tariffs will be. Why is the president standing by this decision?
Because he argues, and his economic team argues, that China's abuse of the United States, either through limited access to the Chinese market or requirements that that American businesses are to operate in China, they must give up a majority percentage of their company, meaning it has to be at least 51% owned by a Chinese national, or Chinese efforts, mostly successful, to steal intellectual property of American-made inventions. All things contribute not only to a trade imbalance, but to hostile trade practices that have to be dealt with. And the way to get China's attention is to apply tariffs. Plenty of American allies say, no, that's really not the best way to approach this. The best way is to take this with other negotiating partners, other European and, let's say, Canadian or Mexican trading partners, and jointly or collectively take these issues to the Chinese and threaten denial of market access. This president does not want to do this. He wants to do it nation by nation, one-on-one. And this begins with $34 billion in tariffs on Chinese goods. Can go to 50. The president has created the perception and the announcement that it can go to $200 billion. And administration officials have made it abundantly clear, if there is not a change in Chinese behavior, there could be tariffs of up to $500 billion on Chinese goods. So it's not a full-blown trade war yet, but the tariffs have begun. The Chinese have announced they will reciprocate $34 billion on their side to U.S. exports into China. And if this keeps moving in this direction, what's starting now is a trade skirmish could become a full-blown trade war.
And it's a significant development because we've moved beyond any sort of bluffing that may have been part of the negotiation. It's actually been enacted.
That's right. These are real. And for weeks here at the White House, Larry Kudlow, who is the president's top economic advisor, head of the National Economic Council, Kevin Hassett, who's the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, and others have tried to offer these sort of soothing words. Well, nothing's happened yet. There are no tariffs yet. Let's see where we get. Let's see what we can accomplish. We've laid our grievances on the table. Let's see how the Chinese respond. And because this still is, when you look at the size of the two economies, $34 billion is at the lower, smaller end of the spectrum. That's true. So it is a skirmish, but the skirmish has begun. It's no longer theoretical. It's no longer abstraction. It's no longer a threat or a negotiating chit. It's real.
Right.
And the Chinese have said, we're going to respond. Every time you ratchet up against us, we're going to ratchet up our tariffs and limit your access. We're not going to get to these other issues you want to get to, Mr. President, intellectual property, ownership requirements, and the like. We're just going to respond with tariffs.
All right.
And if that continues, then what the fear is among the Chamber of Commerce right across the street, which had a full-blown article this week criticizing the president's approach, National Association of Manufacturers, other large business groups in America are telling this White House, if you go down this road and this trade war intensifies, American jobs are going to be jeopardized. U.S. exports are going to be jeopardized. Market access is going to be limited. And American workers many, not all, but many in states that Donald Trump won to become president are going to feel it first.
All right, we'll have to see where this trade skirmish, still a skirmish, goes from here. Major, on another topic now, the president is set to announce his Supreme Court nominee Monday night. Here's what he had to say about his pick on Friday during his weekly address.
In choosing Justice Kennedy's replacement, my greatest responsibility is to select a justice who will faithfully interpret the Constitution as written. Judges are not supposed to rewrite the law, reinvent the Constitution, or substitute their own opinions for the will of the people expressed through their laws. We reject judicial activism and policymaking from the bench.
Major, what does this statement indicate about who President Trump might choose?
Well, all the nominees, or rather, they're not nominees yet, all those the president has looked at, first from his list of 25 potential nominees, down to about 6, now really down to 3, maybe 4 appellate court justices, all have at least some background or experience in this idea of strict constructionism. What does that mean? What the president just said. What does the Constitution plainly say, and what does the law or the challenge to that constitutionality say about what the Constitution says? Meaning, has a state law been passed or has a federal law been passed to enlarge our interpretation, and go off those documents and those documents only, either the Constitution itself as written or the law that's being challenged before the Supreme Court. When the president talks about judicial activism, he is using words that conservatives have applied to so-called liberal justices of the past 30 or 40, even 50 years, who they allege have not read what the Constitution says, but created larger rights not specifically outlined in the Constitution. An example of that would be interpretations of some civil rights statutes. Certainly Roe versus Wade, which created a federal right to access to abortion, and certain elements of commerce larger than the Constitution itself outlines.
Right.
And that is why Democrats and those who have been favorably inclined to this progressive, if you will, or liberal interpretation of the Constitution are so nervous about this president's choice to fill the seat of Anthony Kennedy, because they fear that a majority of 6-3, or 5-4, or a harder one, will create opportunities to eradicate Roe versus Wade and the federally defined right to abortion, or other civil rights or other rights created by the Supreme Court and in conflict because of Supreme Court decisions that this president, with this appointment, could reverse or dramatically change.
We have one more topic I'd love to get to with you, Major. Andrew Wheeler is serving as interim chief of the Environmental Protection Agency following Scott Pruitt's resignation. Who is Andrew Wheeler? What more can you tell us about him? And would there be any potential that he would pass a confirmation hearing if he were tapped?
Well, the president's been ambiguous about whether or not he would nominate Andrew Wheeler to be the confirmed administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. He's content to have him as acting administrator right now. He's confirmed as the deputy, which means he has a role that has been Senate confirmed, and the president can name him as the acting administrator. And that's apparently where it's going to sit for some period of time. Maybe for this entire calendar year, because if you look at this Supreme Court nomination we're expecting on Monday, much of the confirmation conversation in Washington is going to be devoted to that Supreme Court pick.
Certainly. And
who is Andrew Wheeler? Who is Andrew Wheeler? That's the most important question. If you care about either the Pruitt agenda at the Environmental Protection Agency, if you're a conservative or free market conservative, deregulatory inclined, you'll be very happy with Andrew Wheeler, because he is exactly as Scott Pruitt was. Hostile to the idea of the Environmental Protection Agency going outside of the direct established legal regulatory regime, not looking to do anything to the fossil fuel industry that would retard its growth or engage in any particular regulation to limit greenhouse gas emissions because you believe climate change is a serious public policy or public health issue. Scott Pruitt did not. Andrew Wheeler does not. He was a former coal industry lobbyist, and before that he worked on Capitol Hill for one of the most conservative Republicans, Jim Inhofe, and one of the more visible climate change deniers within the Republican conference in the United States Senate. So his pedigree, his history, intellectually and politically and from a policy point of view, is to be deeply skeptical about climate change itself and the need of the federal government to dramatically intervene to regulate greenhouse gas emissions or other pollutants under the idea that doing so will help the world or help America cope with climate change.
All right,
Exactly.
Major Garrett, thank you so much for your insight.
Thank you. Sure.